Hey coach, I know we've done this like multiple times, but still like can you like introduce yourself a little bit?
Oh, sure, Boucher Snyder. I kind of made most of my living as a track coach, but I also do a lot of consulting work with other sports, mostly speed power based training types of consulting, and also do a lot of return to play rehabilitation type of consulting work. I have a lot of experience in those fields and other sports as well.
Cool, cool. So, mm, when it comes to like neuromuscular fatigue, I know we kind of like discussed it before. There's like three stages like neuromuscular fatigue, but how exactly like how many times do we need to like recover from the first stage, the second stage, and the third stage?
The recovery rates for those stages vary tremendously. Obviously, if you're in the first stage of overtraining, it's a fairly quick process, 24, 36 hours or something along those lines. And it also kind of depends on what you're doing recovery wise. Are you doing the nutrition? Are you doing the rest? Are the other things that are helping along the restoration process? I think it's important to remember that most of the fatigue associated, we call it neuromuscular fatigue, and it is related to neuromuscular drop off. But the roots of it are found in the other tissues, muscle tissue, connective tissues, and so forth, fatigue. And as a result of that, the central nervous system sends an inhibition, a protective inhibition in those situations. I don't think that in stage one, the actual restoration is the nervous system. It's the other tissues that are producing that inhibition of the nervous system. And that's why you can typically get out of those types of things pretty good. Genuine neuromuscular fatigue takes quite a while. Obviously, for the second stage of neuromuscular fatigue, you're looking at probably in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 days to recover completely. When you see significant decreases in coordination and significant decreases in elasticity. It's normally a 4 to 5 day process. And again, a lot of this is driven by inhibition. The third stage is a problem. If you allow yourself to get to the point where you actually see significant power drop offs, then you're talking about anywhere as maybe 10 days or whatever to kind of get back if everything is handled correctly. You have to do things to accelerate the restoration processes and do everything right. And I do think that when you get to stage three of this overtraining paradigm, I do think that that's when you actually do have some fatigue in the nervous system itself, probably neurotransmitter issues and imbalances and things of that nature. So I think this is the stage where you actually genuinely do see neural fatigue, so to speak. And it's not just vegetative tissues, muscle tissues, things of that nature that are setting things up with this inhibition. So I think those are kind of the typical time frames that I see as far as recovery, restoration from those particular stages. But I do think that it's important that your listeners know that if you're training hard, you're going to dabble and bounce into stage one of overtraining on a fairly regular basis. And you're going to dabble in stage two during really hard training phases as well. However, that's why when you get to the intensities of training that will bring you into stage two of overtraining, that's why it's important that those types of workouts are spaced significantly apart. That's why you see me typically doing heavy Olympic lifts or really intense plyometrics, speed development, things of that nature, with significant spacing in between those sessions for that particular reason.
Nice, nice, nice. So, um, what like is it only the off season where you're gonna go to like the third stage of neuromuscular fatigue?
I don't think that you should, to be honest with you. I think that's hands off. Yeah. I don't think we should get to the point where we see significant power drops in those situations again. So I don't think that that's a zone you want to hit. I think that's a zone that you're trying to stay away from, to be honest with you. When you get to that point, you've reached a very, very deep training stage and you've probably starting to do some harm in those situations and such. So I don't think that you should get into stage three, to be honest with you. I'm not just saying that some well-meaning coach didn't touch it once or twice, but we have to recognize it immediately. And I do recognize that as a mistake.
Cool. Cool. Okay. So I'm gonna jump into the next topic about like teaching plyometric, how people land when they do jump training. So Uh, I know usually like some coach is gonna teach like shoulder width or hip width. Do you think that how they land matters and like what exactly should be like the stand width?
The stance width,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it does matter to some extent when you're doing higher intensity plyometrics because it really affects what types of stresses are being applied to the joints of the chain. Some people would argue that in sports, you find yourself in awkward situations all the time, and therefore it doesn't matter because it's not likely your feet are going to be perfectly set in the sporting activity. And that is, there's some truth to that. And there may be some truth to that when you're looking at the lower levels of plyometrics. But the way I look at plyometric training is this: what are the positions and techniques that will allow me to achieve the highest intensities safely? Achieving the highest intensity safely so that we can put those tissues into higher levels of load and those tissues become more resilient. So therefore, if I am using the proper techniques, proper stances and foot spacings and things of that nature, I'm capable of achieving much higher intensities safely. Therefore, the tissues become much stronger. Therefore, in sporting situations, when I find myself in erratic situations and I don't have the opportunity to put my feet down perfectly, then I have developed a degree of resilience. If I am haphazard about the way that I teach the plyometrics and foot spacing and things of that nature at the highest levels, well, then I can never load the tissues accordingly. So ultimately, that's what it's about. At the highest levels, we look for perfect mechanics so that we can make mistakes and have a bandwidth of good function at the lower intensities that we're typically going to accomplish and such. So that's the way I basically look at it and such. So that's why I'm basically, in double leg plyometrics, a kind of a shoulder width type of person for the most part and such. But when you look at the simple in place jump routines that I use and some of the other things that I do that are not on the highest level as far as intensity are concerned, then you'll see a wide variety of different foot spacings and foot contacts and things of that nature as well. So diversity at the lower end and trying to hone in on perfect models at the higher ends when we look at intensity. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, yeah, I quite like
Sure.
that. I saw
Okay.
that every day. I saw those every day.
That's why, you would never say this, okay? Like you would never say, well, let's run with bad mechanics so that if we get tired, we practice bad mechanics. You would never do that. You would always look for perfect mechanics and perfect execution with the understanding that that creates some degree of resiliency so that when your running mechanics break down a little bit because of fatigue, you're still within an acceptable bandwidth that you're not going to get hurt. Why in plyometrics would we look at it any differently? You wouldn't say, let's do our heavy power cleans with bad techniques. If technique breaks down, we'll be ready. You wouldn't do this. Why do we look at plyometrics any differently? I guess that's what I'm getting at here.
Yeah, nice, nice. So, in your experience, is it usually like track coaches like are chasing or like trying to teach like the perfect technique and like uh the strength and conditioning coaches kind of like don't have the idea or don't know how to coach perfect technique, or am I wrong?
I don't like to put any profession in a box or characterize one profession, to be honest with you. I've been to track and field practices where I've watched plyometrics being taught, and it looks like a horror show. And then I've seen, strength and conditioning coaches who do fantastic jobs. And so I'm not nearly prepared to put any one profession at fault or anything along those lines. I will say that if you look at track and field coaches, because track and field is a pure power sport for the most part and doesn't have that big of a technical issue, technical considerations in many situations. I do think that sometimes the models for plyometric training in track and field are simpler. And as a result of that, maybe you might see some of what you might be experiencing or what you might, um, some of the things that you might be alluding to. Whereas strength and conditioning coaches sometimes feel the need to put their athletes into more game like situations, and some of the games, don't put you in those perfect positions all the time. It's not just about always landing and always being responsive in a predictable manner. So that might be the reason why you might observe some of these things, but I wouldn't, you know, necessarily rate one group as coaching it better by any means.
Cool, cool. So, we talk about the stand width for plyometric. How about the stance width for change of direction, like shuffle or crossover? When they decel and like change, like try to like push off, like what is the stance width should be
Yeah,
like?
well, it's got to be wider. If you're making a true redirection, stance has to be wider. And typically, we try to keep center of mass over that post leg, and we kind of reach out with the other leg. And if you look at it, then what you have is basic starting mechanics. You have a quick push off of the outside foot, and then you have a long extended push off of the inside foot. The thing that I look at there that sometimes tends to make it somewhat unsafe is when we see athletes that don't have the proper amortization patterns. If you look at change of direction and the necessity to have a wider stance there, that's inarguable. But if you look at that, what you see on that inside leg, that post leg, you see that leg go into much deeper degrees of flexion than the other leg. In fact, the other leg is practically extended in many situations. And when you go into those deep angles of flexion, then the body becomes at risk if the amortization patterns are not correct. So, in short, if the hip absorbs and flexes, and the knee absorbs and flexes, and the ankle absorbs and flexes, and we see fairly equal degrees of amortization in all three joints in those situations, then we tend to stay healthy. But unfortunately, a lot of people, for one reason or another, be it bias or be it laziness or be it poor training or whatever the case may be, a lot of times we see people who are hip dominant who tend to bend at the waist and don't like to bend the knees, or we see people who are knee dominant who really don't use the hips as well as they should. And these are the people that are typically more at risk, for different types of injuries in those situations. I've always found. Another thing is when you look at the outside foot, you're going to have the foot's not aligned the same way it would be in a sprint start, even though there are a lot of commonalities there as far as the quick response that we see there and the contributions that we see from that outside foot. So therefore, if the foot itself isn't pliable and mobile and all of the bones of the foot aren't gliding as they should, then that's kind of a recipe for injuries as well on the outside foot, particularly Achilles injuries and things like that, if the foot isn't operating the way it should.
Cool, cool. You brought up like there's hip dominant and knee dominant. So, uh, like you mentioned, if someone shows like a hip dominant or knee, are you going to like correct that?
Oh, you have to correct it. There's no doubt. And typically, to correct it, often the change of movement activities are too technically complicated for you to really address that. You need a simpler type of thing, and that's why I often use drop jump types of situations. I'll have an athlete put them up on some type of box, not super high necessarily, but I'll put them up on some type of box and have them fall. And when they fall, I'm looking for a fairly firm landing. I'm looking for an absence of valgus when they land, and I'm looking for fairly stiff type of landing, not totally stiff, but some degree of stability in landing. Another exercise that I'll have them do is I'll have them land and bounce, looking at kind of the same thing. And then the third exercise I do that's the real opportunity to evaluate is I'll have them come off that box and land in a high position, but immediately drop into a squat. And when they drop into that squat, a lot of times that'll give you clues. You'll see some athletes that won't have ducked correctly in those situations. You'll see some athletes who keep the torso upright and don't bend at the hips, and you see all all of the amortization taking place in the knee. You'll see some who don't like to bend the knees and they'll drop the chest because they're hip dominant. And that's an opportunity to identify it in a simpler movement pattern, a simpler uh, motor environment. And that gives you the opportunity to teach. That's when you get the chance to really correct these things. That's why these things have been a part of my knee rehab, ACL rehab for a long time. And it's interesting because when I do an ACL rehab or a knee rehab of some type, and we get to this stage, you can pretty much always identify why that person injured that ACL in the first place. You can pretty much identify why it happened, what that person's movement biases are, and you are also capable of correcting it at that point. So we forget that about rehab sometimes. It's also about correction, not just about getting an athlete back ready.
Nice, nice. So I know some coaches would say that if athletes more knee dominant, there's probably more fascia base or like more elastic, and some athlete if it's more hip dominant, they're probably more muscle based. So can you share your thoughts on like what coaches say fascia based athlete and muscle based athlete?
Yeah, typically we think of the fascia base as stiffer, kind of, we often associate fascia base with stiffness and such, which it sometimes is a good quality. And this is why the training for a 100-meter sprinter and a soccer player who has to change direction 1,000 times in a game are somewhat different, because, you know, for that 100-meter sprinter, you're trying to drive that fascial stuff where everything is super responsive. And there comes a time when those deep angles aren't very important to them anymore because you're trying to develop as much stiffness as you possibly can. Whereas on the other hand, that person in that team sport that is constantly redirecting and constantly experiencing change of direction, you have to train them a little different. There's what you stated is absolutely true, and it's why we train different athletes in different sports somewhat differently at the highest levels. At the lowest levels, I think we make the mistake sometimes of training them too specifically, but at the highest levels, that's why this is important.
Well, so do you think that uh fascia like fascia what's so called fascia based athlete is trainable? Like people who are supposed to be muscle based, are we able to like train them like more like towards fascia based?
Well, I don't have never done biopsies, but I would have to say yes because I've seen athletes that aren't responsive become responsive and improve in those areas. So within the bandwidth of your genetics and with the bandwidth of your personal talent levels, yeah, I think there are some adaptations that are available in that particular realm. And we see fascia realign. We see fascia uh, adjust itself in response to training stresses all the time. So why not this?
Cool, cool, cool. So I want to ask another thing is about like I know there's a saying called high day high, low day low. So like probably I think it's probably start from track world, and it's like I know some track coaches do heavy lifting on the same day they do like speed work, like maybe Monday and Friday when they do acceleration or max velocity. They also do uh heavy lifting, and the days in between they probably do um just recovery lift. So do you think this is a thing that like this type of stuff is also good for like team sport athletes?
Yeah, the what you're discussing is what I call grouping your training by neuromuscular demand. The most important system that we're training is the nervous system ultimately, and what you're training the nervous system for is electrical output. The magnitude of electrical output, the frequency of electrical output is ultimately what you're training. 99% of our training is not toward muscle. It's training the nervous system to be better at activating the muscle, and the muscle reacts as accordingly due to the increased levels of stimulation. So if the nervous system is the most important system, then it makes sense that we should train it at a very high level on certain days. And it also makes sense that we should rest it on other days. And that's why many coaches, myself included, are coaches who like to group speed-based training and plyometric-based training and our key weightlifting exercises, our major core weightlifting exercises on the same day because those are all activities that are very high in neural demand. They require high levels of electrical output. Whereas other days, when you're doing circuit training or fitness-based stuff or restoration-based stuff or whatever, it could very well be that the athletes think that those are extremely tough days, but they're not difficult as far as the nervous system is concerned, and there's restoration that's actually taking place in the nervous system. So that's what we call grouping by neuromuscular demand. Unfortunately, most team sports are a nasty mix of neural and general demand. So if you look at the team sport, there isn't a part. If you look at a basketball game, for example, we don't play a neural game on Monday and a general day game on Tuesday. That's not the nature of that sport, right? So ultimately, the sports themselves are nasty mixes of those two. But however, what I've noticed is that when we train and group by neuromuscular demand, not on the court, but in the performance training model, the messages that are sent to the body's adaptive processes are much clearer. Clearer messages result in faster and more complete, more permanent adaptations. So even though these sports don't show a genuine delineation between those two types of works in the games themselves, as far as the performance training components are concerned, we're typically better off by following those same grouping. So just understand that that you're not going to be able to do that with the court time. But when it comes to the other aspects, the things that are off the court, the things that are off the field, the things that are truly performance based, that aren't nearly as sports specific, then it's really a good idea to follow that model for that reason because I've just noticed that when we kind of mix all that stuff up, that ultimately the adaptations just aren't nearly as permanent and aren't as quick to occur. So to answer your question is understand there are times you can't, but do it whenever you can.
Cool. So, uh, um, for the other thing about like team sport is like the periodization of team sport. I know we kind of talk about like periodization for track, but how about periodization for team sport? What are the thing, what are the thing the main goal for off season and in season is?
Well, in season, you have to think in terms of management, and there are certain qualities that are important that in season you have to maintain, So and a lot of times these decisions vary from sport to sport because all sports are different, So for example, if we were looking at plyometric training, okay, if you're coaching an athlete that's doing basketball or volleyball or something like that where there's tons of jumping, there's really no need to have lower level or moderate level jumping in the program because there's so much of it involved in the sport itself. However, if you look at those sports, you might say, well, how often are those tissues loaded to the highest levels? And you might say, not very often. So you might find the need for very high intensity plyometrics, albeit on a very rare basis, maybe every 3 weeks or something like that. Not much, maybe 10, 12, 15 contacts just to make sure those tissues remain accustomed to those levels of load. Then if I look at a person who's like a long jumper in track and field, that person loads those tissues to the absolute maximal level in their competition on a weekly basis. So there's no need to have high intensity plyometrics for that person in the training situation. However, because of the fact that they compete only once a week, they need to have some lower level plyometrics in the training program to maintain stimulation in between. Unless you're a weightlifter, there's really nothing that takes place in a team sport that resembles the demands of weightlifting, which is why just about every team sport tries to keep their weight training program going in some way, shape, or form. Some sports never touch maximal velocity, but touching maximal velocity, every so often, maybe every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, or something like that, is a good idea because the tissue load subjects these let me rephrase that, the level of tissue load that the tissues are subjected to maintains resilience against soft tissue injury. So these are the things we think of, you know. Change of direction is another one. Like maybe your sport doesn't involve jumping, but if it's a big change of direction sport, that's a lot of plyometric activity there as well. So there is no answer for in season. It all is determined by what are the demands of the sport, what is the athlete regularly subjected to, what is the athlete not subjected to, that is important to maintain, and then we make wise decisions based upon those observations and such. And sadly and unfortunately, some of those observations are going to be subjective. You know, there's no pure testing protocol that'll tell you exactly what you want, you know, as much as we would like there to be one. Now, when it comes to off season, um, this is where I try to encourage team sports to value athletic development. Where you put where you put your efforts, I think is important. And I know that if you're a performance coach, a lot of times some of the things that you do are dictated to you by sport coaches. Sometimes some of the things you do are not necessarily things that you would necessarily like to do, because you might, if you're a performance coach and you're working for uh, a college team and you're a performance coach who's making $70,000 and the head basketball coach is making $2 million, well, $2 million rules over $70,000, and it's going to some extent that person's going to come in your office and say, I want this, So I understand in practicality these things happen. But that being said, it's important to understand that a lot of times this is what I see happening in team sports a lot, is that these coaches want these athletes in top shape all the time. And when I say top shape, I don't mean speed power. I mean fitness, like glycolytic anaerobic types of fitness. And sometimes I think what happens is we spend so much time obsessing over their fitness levels and such that we forget to carve times out of the year where these athletes can actually become stronger, where these athletes can actually become faster, where these athletes can actually um, become more elastic, improve their jumping capabilities and such, I'm of the opinion that in many, many programs, we obsess so much about fitness levels and such, we kind of just forget this. This is why when I consult with an American football team, for example, when the bowl game's over and it comes back to work, instead of just worrying about fitness so much, that's a nice block of time to get your athletes stronger, get them faster, get them more explosive, improve their elasticity and these types of qualities. And they'll be somewhat fit, because of the nature of that type of work. But the actual crowning level fitness that you need in order to play the game or whatever, that can be developed in a few weeks. So, for example, getting back to what I was saying, an American football team, they come out of the bowl game, and it's early January. I like to see them spend January and February not really worrying about fitness too much and just trying to make gains in speed qualities and elastic qualities and power and those types of things. And then you go to spring practice, and maybe a couple of weeks before spring practice, you might throw in a little bit of fitness. Then you get out of spring practice and go back to the speed power stuff. And then when you get close, well, to the season, well, you have training camp where you can get in shape and do all of that type of stuff. So in short, the idea of number one, carving times out where we actually invest in athletic development to me is important. And then the other part of it is not corrupting athletic development. We all know that if you're trying to make an athlete faster, it requires high intensity efforts, and you have to provide rest in between those efforts. So many a well-meaning basketball coaches walked into a performance workout and saw great sprinting taking place. And then the basketball coach says, oh, this is great. I like this, but the rests, they're too long. We need to shorten those rests down. So what we've done is we've taken a good model and we've corrupted it, by not really understanding what we're trying to accomplish. So those are my thoughts basically on in-season training. And the third thing I'd like to share with your listeners is that um, speed power training is a generic type of thing, meaning that it shouldn't really look that different for a basketball player or a soccer player or a football player or anybody, meaning that ultimately the rules and the techniques we use coaching wise to advance these levels, are based on physiology. They're not based on sport. So in many situations, they really should be somewhat similar and somewhat generic. I think it's another mistake to become overly specific at that particular time. You know, they're going to spend enough court time, field time, whatever the case may be, to get specific work done there.
Nice, nice, nice. So, one thing I noticed is like, I think probably because of the culture, so even the athlete themselves want to do like cardio or endurance training during the off season, which is like pretty weird.
No, it is, you know. But what I try to tell these coaches, two things to kind of put their minds at ease. First of all, the general component, you know, the things that you do for restoration are lactate based. So restoration training doesn't mean you're lying around in a whirlpool. You know, restoration training means you're working, you know, because the lactate that's produced produces some endocrine responses. So if you're training in a good speed power model, you're never going to be unfit. You're always going to be fit. We're talking about bringing yourself from a 90% to 100% level of anaerobic glycolytic fitness. We're not talking about 0 to 100. We're talking about 90 to 100. And the other thing is, remember, glycolytic adaptations, they're not structural, they're chemical. You know, if you're looking at aerobic stuff, which really isn't important for most team sports, the aerobic stuff, you're building mitochondria, you're building capillaries. That takes a long time because you're actually building tissues, you're building things. It takes time. But anaerobic adaptations are chemical in nature. So they happen pretty quick. We're not talking about months, we're talking about days and weeks at the most, you know. So those adaptations take place pretty quickly. So you can take a person who's fairly fit and you can have them at peak fitness in a couple of weeks with really very little trouble. Surely enough to play a soccer game or a basketball game or whatever and be perfect.
So, the the lactate based recovery stuff is also useful for what we discussed on earlier about like the neuromuscular fatigue first stage and second stage, right?
Oh yeah, that's what brings those tissues back. You know, ultimately restoration is always rooted in endocrine responses. You know, and that's where you get those. You know, I remember when I was a young coach and I got started, I read all the great books of all the great training people and whatever. And a lot of those books said, you know, do these circuits. And I did the circuits and I found that the athletes looked great. And when they said cut out the circuits, I found that the athletes didn't look nearly as good. And I didn't realize at that time that that was actually what was producing the restoration. When I pulled those circuits away, then what I found when we pulled the circuits away is that they didn't recover nearly as well. It's hard for a young coach to wrap their head around the idea that you can actually do this stuff that's pretty hard and it produces the effects of rest. You know, when I read those old books and they said to stop doing the circuits, I didn't realize that there was a drug bias in some of those books and some of the restoration in those training cycles was coming from syringes and things of that nature.
Cool, cool. So, the other thing about like the periodization of in season and off season is like we mentioned, you should all like speed and power. Speed is like like basketball, track and field, soccer, speed is speed. So like how like how many work should coaches put into like correct the mechanics for like team sport athletes?
Well, I think that anytime that you work, you're always teaching technique. It doesn't matter if you're in the weight room or plyometrics or whatever. So, you know, you can stand there and watch it, you can teach. So, in short, you know, do you expect perfection? Probably not. You know, I can find minor technical flaws in the world's greatest sprinters at this particular time. But no, I think that good coaches are always looking for opportunities to teach. Remember, improved mechanics always results in resilience to injury. And I always also feel that movement quality is a thing, meaning that movement quality bridges weights and plyometrics and sprinting and all of these things. And we always just want to try to teach biomechanical efficiency. So I look at it, teaching sprint mechanics as kind of a subset in that regard. I do think, however, though, that hyper analyzing sprint mechanics is typically not productive. You know, so many of the so many of the things that we should see in good running or sprint mechanics come about because of the way we train. I remember when I was a young coach and I first started working with really, really good athletes, this is like 1990 or something like that, and we would be out there doing accelerations and they would sprint, I would coach. They would sprint, I would coach. And I'm coaching my tail off and they're getting better and better and better. And then 2 years later, I keep my mouth shut a lot more, saying a lot less, and they're still getting better at the same rates. And that's when I realized that ultimately what we're really seeing is the mobility stuff and the power stuff and all of these other things that you're doing, they are really the things that are driving a lot of the improvements mechanically as well. So keep in mind that a lot of sprint mechanics aren't things that you have to teach. My philosophy of developing an athlete to sprint, jump, whatever, is basically to train the human body to do what nature intended. And if you do that, most of the technical stuff is kind of taken care of for you.
Nice. Because after I train, after I personally train track and learn from, like, try to learn from different track athletes, and I w go back to like coach team sport athlete like baseball, like soccer, I was like, should I coach him? Should I change the mechanic? Should I try to do something or not? That's
There's
always
never
come.
a Yeah, there's never a bad time to do the right thing. That's the bottom line there. And by taking that person and improving their mechanics, you develop resiliency to injury and you increase their levels of performance, you increase their levels of power. The thing that I guard against, though, is to overcoach it, meaning, keep in mind that if you take anybody when they sprint, you're going to see certain things that are technical mistakes, but you're also going to see things that are pathological, you know, things that are related to muscle imbalances, things that are related to strength deficits, things that are related to mobility deficits, and things of that nature. And those are things that, if you're trying to address them technically, you're going to frustrate an athlete because they're not capable of dealing with them technically at that level of fitness, at that level of conditioning. So in these situations, what we have to do is identify what are true technical mistakes and what are mistakes that are going to fix themselves as a result of spending time in the weight room, in the plyos, spending time in the other avenues of training that you pursue on a daily basis.
Cool. So, um, that's basically all I have for you today. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to?
My email is bschex at sacspeed.com, bschex at sacspeed.com, and my website is sacspeed, SAC, speed.com.